Good afternoon, my name is Isis Torres, and today I'm going to be talking about an analysis video from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is a tragic play by William Shakespeare which looks at the many different perspectives to love. This ranges from the crude and inelegant views from Samson and Gregory, and the strictly marriage-based outlook from Lady Capulet, and the star-crossed but fatally ill-omened love that between Romeo and Juliet which ultimately leads to their deaths. Romeo and Juliet were Shakespeare's second tragedy and was most likely written between 1594 and 1596. Romeo and Juliet are arguably one of Shakespeare's best loved plays, spanning from centuries of spin-offs, including Sergei Prokofiev's beautiful classical music, countless sculptures and paintings, at least 24 operas, several musicals including West Side Story, pop songs, and film versions. While there is no proof that the story is in fact true, in the 13th century there were certainly two feuding Italian families. The Montecchio of Verona and the Capulet of Cremona were locked in political struggle. These two families are referred to in the Dante's Purgatory Canto 4. It is not known if they had children named Romeo and Juliet. Many modern productions and adaptations opt to represent the Montague and Capulet divide in different ways by placing the story within specific historical context. Some stories juxtapose the two families by cultural beliefs, religious associations, or race. This has accounted for numerous retellings, from setting the story in Northern Ireland with the title characters from Protestant and Catholic families in communist during the Cold War, through to rival mafia families and gang warfare. Verona is the setting of virtually the whole of Romeo and Juliet. It is used as the setting in three of Shakespeare's plays, The Taming of Shrew, The True Gentleman of Verona, and Romeo and Juliet, but it is unknown if Shakespeare ever visited the city. List of characters. Juliet, Capulet's daughter. She is presented as a young and innocent adolescent, not yet 14 years old. Her joyfulness is stressed throughout the play to illustrate her progression from adolescence to maturity, and to emphasize her position as a tragic heroine. Juliet's love for Romeo gives her the strength and courage to defy her parents and face death twice. Romeo, Montague's son, who is loved and respected in Verona. He is initially represented as a comic lover who is with his inflated declarations of love for Rosalind. After meeting Juliet, he abandons his tendency to be a traditional fashionable lover, and his language becomes intense, reflecting his genuine passion for Juliet. By avenging Mercutio's death, he sets in motion a chain of tragic events that culminate in suicide when he mistakenly believes Juliet to be dead. Mercutio, kinsman to the prince and friend of Romeo. His name comes from a word Mercury, the element which indicates his quick temper. Mercutio is boldly talkative and tries to tease Romeo out of his melancholy frame of mind. He accepts Tybalt's challenge to defend Romeo's honor and is killed, thus precipitating Romeo's enraged reaction, during which Romeo kills Tybalt. Tybalt, Lady Capulet's nephew and Juliet's cousin. Tybalt is violent and hot-tempered with a strong sense of honor. He challenges Romeo to a duel in response to Romeo's attending a Capulet party. His challenge to Romeo is taken up by Mercutio, whom Tybalt kills. Romeo then kills Tybalt. The nurse, Juliet's nursemaid, who acts as a confidant and messenger for Romeo and Juliet. Like Mercutio, the nurse loves to talk and romances, and her attitude towards love is bodily. The nurse is loving and affectionate toward Juliet, but compromises her position of trust when she advises Juliet to forget Romeo and comply with her parents' wishes and marry Paris. Friar Lawrence, a brother of the Franciscan order and Romeo's confessor, who advises both Romeo and Juliet. The friar agrees to marry the couple in secret in the hope that marriage will restore peace between their families. His plans to reunite Juliet with Romeo are thwarted by the influence of fate. The friar cognotes the potion plot through which Juliet appears dead for 42 hours in order to avoid marrying Paris. At the end of the play, the prince recognizes the friar's good intentions. Capulet, Juliet's father, is quick-tempered and impetuous, but is initially reluctant to consent that Juliet's married with Paris, because Juliet is so young. Later, he changes his mind and angrily demands that Juliet obey his wishes. The death of Romeo and Juliet reconcile Capulet and Montague. Paris, a noble young kinsman to the prince. Paris is well-mannered and attractive and hopes to marry Juliet. Romeo fights and kills Paris at the Capulet tomb when Paris thinks that Romeo has come to desecrate the bodies of Tybalt and Juliet. Benvolio, Montague's nephew and friend of Romeo and Mercutio. Benvolio is a peacemaker who attempts to keep peace between Tybalt and Mercutio. After the deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt, Benvolio acts as a chorus explaining how events took place. Lady Capulet. Lady Capulet is vengeful and she demands Romeo's death for killing Tybalt. In her relationship with Juliet, she is cold and distant, expecting Juliet to obey her father and marry Paris. Montague, Romeo's father, who is concerned by his son's melancholy behavior. Balthasar, Romeo's servant. He brings Romeo the news in Mantua that Juliet is dead. An apothecary, a poverty-stricken chemist who illegally sells potion to Romeo. Escalus, Prince of Verona, the symbol of law and order in Verona, but he fails to prevent further outbreaks of the violence between the Montagues and Capulets. Only the death of Romeo and Juliet, rather than the authority of the prince, restored peace. Friar John, a brother of the Franciscan order sent by Friar Lawrence to tell Romeo of his living potion plan for Juliet. The friar is prevented from getting to Mantua and the message does not reach Romeo. Lady Montague. In contrast with Lady Capulet, Lady Montague is peace-loving and dislikes the violence of the feud. Like her husband, she is concerned by his son's withdrawn and sensitive behavior. The news of Romeo's banishment breaks her heart and she dies of grief. Peter, a Capulet servant attending the nurse. Abram, a servant to Montague. Samson, servant of the Capulet household. Gregory, servant of the Capulet household. Conflict. The play portrays the reality of a transparent feud between two households, Montagues and Capulets, which resulted in tragic consequences for the main characters, Romeo and Juliet. The events contrast hate with love, forcing the young star-crossed lovers to grow up quickly and die tragically in despair. Conflict is finally resolved in the denouncement of this exceptional play. Romeo and Juliet, the two heroes, both killed themselves. It is also the outcome of the play because the truth about the secret marriage, the elaborate ploys by the Friar Lawrence confession, I married them. Plot, act by act, and scenes. Act 1, Scene 1. The play opens with two servants from the house of Capulet talking about their hatred of the Montagues. They meet two servants from the house of Montague and a fight breaks out. Benvolio tries to stop the fight, but when Tybalt arrives, things get worse. With his line, "As I hate hell, all Montagues and thee. Have at thee, coward." The fight escalates until there is a huge street brawl involving both Lord Montague and Lord Capulet. The fight is eventually stopped when the prince stops everyone, saying, "On main of torture from those bloody hands," throwing distemper weapons to the ground. He is so angry he proclaims, if there is another fight, Montague and Capulet shall pay the forfeit with their lives. Everyone departs, leaving Lord and Lady Montague talking to Benvolio about their son Romeo, who has been missing all day. Benvolio promises to find out where Romeo has been and what's upsetting him. Romeo reveals to Benvolio that he is in love with Rosaline, but she doesn't love him in return. Act 1, Scene 2. Paris visits Lord Capulet to ask for Juliet's hand in marriage. Lord Capulet thinks Juliet is too young to marry, saying to Paris, "Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride." However, he later encourages Paris to woo her at a ball at his house. Lord Capulet sends a messenger to invite other guests to the ball. The messenger bumps into Romeo and Benvolio, revealing to them the ball is taking place and that Rosaline is one of their guests. Benvolio suggests they go to the ball so Romeo can find someone else to fall in love with. Romeo agrees to go, not to find a new love but to prove that Rosaline is the prettiest, saying, I'll go alone, I'll go going, no such sight to be shown, but to rejoice in splendor of mine own. Act 1, Scene 3. Lady Capulet is searching for her daughter who is getting ready for the ball. Together with the nurse, she tries to convince Juliet that Paris is a good match in marriage, praising him and saying Verona's summer hath not such a flower. The nurse talks about a memory she has of Juliet when she was little girl, saying, Thou wast the prettiest babe that I nursed, and I might live to see their marriage once. I have my wish, and it's also keen for Juliet to marry Paris and to be happy. Act 1, Scene 4. Romeo, Mercutio, and Benvolio are on their way to the ball. Romeo is having second thoughts about attending because he is feeling depressed about Rosaline, telling the others, I have a soul of lead, so strikes me to the ground so I cannot move. He then tells them that he had an ominous dream. Mercutio tries to convince Romeo that dreams are meaningless in his famous Queen Mab speech, telling Romeo, True, I talk of dreams, which is as thing of substance as the air. Eventually Romeo agrees to go to the ball. Act 1, Scene 5. The servants in the Capulet household are getting ready for the ball before Capulet welcomes all the guests. Tybalt sees Romeo and is offended by his presence at the ball, claiming, I'll not endure him, and viewing his presence as an insult. Lord Capulet stops him from confronting Romeo, which makes Tybalt feel even angrier, and he vows to seek revenge. Meanwhile, Romeo meets Juliet at the ball, and they kiss, with Juliet saying, You kiss by the book. Then they both find out who the other is and are separated, with Juliet remarking, My only love sprung from my only hate, too early seen unknown and known too late. Act 2, Scene 1. Romeo climbs over the orchard wall into the Capulet's garden. Mercutio and Benvolio try to find him but soon give up when he doesn't answer, saying, Go then, for this in vain. To seek him here, that means not to be found. Act 2, Scene 2. Juliet appears at her windows, sometimes a balcony, and Romeo watches her from below, saying, But soft, with that light through yonder window breaks. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Romeo listens as she talks about him and eventually speaks to her. They tell each other that they love each other, with Juliet asking him for the exchange for thy love faithful vow for mine. While this, they are talking to the nurse calls Juliet from inside, which hurries her decision to meet the next day and get married, with Juliet saying, If that event of love be honorable, thy purposed marriage send me word tomorrow. Act 2, Scene 3. Friar Lawrence is collecting herbs and plants that he uses for making medicines and potions, saying, I must upfill this osier cage of ours with baleful weeds and precious juice flowers. Romeo joins him and tells him he wants to marry Juliet. At first, Friar Lawrence is dismissive of Romeo's request, as it was only yesterday that he was talking about his love for Rosaline, asking, Is Rosaline, who thou didst love so dear, so soon forsaken? However, he agrees, believing that marriage might help end the feud between the two families. Act 2, Scene 4. Mercutio and Benvolio are still looking for Romeo, who has yet not returned home. They reveal that Tybalt has challenged Romeo to a duel. Mercutio tells Benvolio that Tybalt is a very good swordsman, claiming, Oh, he is the courageous captain of compliments. Romeo arrives and is in a very good mood, and the three friends tease each other, saying to Romeo, Why, is not this better now than grown in full love? Now art thou sociable, now art thou Romeo. The nurse enters and asks to speak to Romeo. He tells her his intentions are true, saying, Nurse, commend me to that lady and mistresses, and that Juliet should visit Friar Lawrence that afternoon so they can marry. Act 2, Scene 5. Juliet is waiting for the nurse to return with news of Romeo's proposal, declaring, "The clock struck 9 when I did send the nurse. In half an hour she promised to return." She is even more irritated by the nurse's reluctance to tell her the news when she comes back from meeting with Romeo. The nurse tells Juliet to visit Friar Lawrence where she'll be married, remarking, "Now comes the wanton blood out in your cheeks. They'll be in scarlet straight at any news." Act 2, Scene 6. Romeo and Juliet meet in secret at Friar Lawrence's cell, with the friar blessing them and saying, "So smile the heavens upon this holy act." They exit together to get married off stage, as the friar tells them, come with me, and we will make this short work. For by your leaves you shall not stay alone, till the Holy Church incorporate two in one." Act 3, Scene 1. Benvolio tries to convince Mercutio to go indoors as the Capulets are on lookout for a fight. Sure enough, Tybalt arrives looking for Romeo. When Romeo does arrive, he refuses to fight with Tybalt, who he is now related to by marriage, saying to him, "I do protest, I never injured thee, but love thee better than thou canst devise." A fight breaks out between Mercutio and Tybalt, which ends with Mercutio being stabbed after Romeo gets in the way. While dying, Mercutio curses both house of Capulet and Montague, exclaiming, "A plague of both your houses, I am sped." In revenge for his friend's death, Romeo seeks out Tybalt and kills him. When the prince arrives, he announces, "And for that offense, immediately we do exile him hence." Act 3, Scene 2. Juliet waits for Romeo to join her after their marriage, impatiently saying, "Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds," towards Phoebus' lodging, but the nurse arrives with news of Tybalt's death. At first, Juliet curses Romeo's name, but when she discovers what happened, she asks, "Shall I speak ill from him that is my husband? Ah, poor my lord, what tongue shall smooth thy name? When I, thy 3 hours wife, I mangle it," and realizes she needs to stand beside her husband. The nurse agrees to get a message to Romeo. Act 3, Scene 3. Romeo is hiding at Friar Lawrence's cell and is given the news that he has been banished. He is distraught and says that being banished is worse than being killed, as he won't be able to see Juliet, telling the friar there is no wall without Verona walls, but purgatory torture hell itself. The nurse arrives with news that Juliet still loves him, and the friar convinces Romeo to run away to Mantua while things settle down in Verona. He tells him to go to Juliet first to consummate their marriage, saying, Go get thee to thy love, how was discreet, ascend her chamber, hence and comfort her." Act 3, Scene 4. Paris visits Lord Capulet to seek Juliet's hand in marriage. At first, Capulet suggests that everyone is too full of grief to entertain the idea of a wedding, but as Paris is about to leave, he has a change of heart and suggests they get married in 3 days' time. "Thursday be it then. You go to Juliet or you go to bed. Prepare her, wife, against this wedding day." Act 3, Scene 5. Romeo and Juliet say goodbye to each other, with Juliet asking, "Are you gone so? Love, Lord, a husband, friend, I must hear from thee every day in the hour. For a minute there are many days." Lady Capulet enters and tells Juliet that she is to marry Paris. Juliet refuses, and when she tells Lord Capulet this, he threatens to disown her if she doesn't agree, saying, "For, by my soul, I never acknowledge thee, nor what is mine shall never do thee good." When they are alone, the nurse tries to convince Juliet to forget Romeo and marry Paris. Juliet decides to visit Friar Lawrence. Act 4, Scene 1. Paris visits Friar Lawrence to plan his own wedding to Juliet. He meets Juliet there, who says she has come for confession. When Paris has left, Juliet threatens to kill herself if the friar cannot help her, saying to him, "Oh, bid me live rather than marry Paris, from off the battlements of yonder tower." The friar devises a plan where Juliet will take a potion that will make her appear dead, and no warmth, no wreath shall testify though lives. Friar Lawrence plans to let Romeo know the truth by a message, so he can collect her from the Capulet family tomb. Act 4, Scene 2. Juliet returns to the family home and begs forgiveness from her father. He is overjoyed and decides to move the date of the wedding to the very next day, exclaiming, "My heart is thunderous light, since this same by-way-bar girl is so reclaimed." Act 4, Scene 3. Due to the change in the date of the wedding, Juliet is forced to take the potion a night early. At first, she worries that maybe the friar has given her a potion, so he's marrying her to Romeo won't be discovered, asking herself, what if it be a potion which the friar subtly hath ministers to have me dead, lest in his marriage she should be dishonored, because he married me before to Romeo? She asks the potions anyway and immediately appears dead. Act 4, Scene 4. The Capulet household prepares for the wedding. Act 4, Scene 5. The nurse discovers the body of Juliet and exclaims, "She's dead, deceased, she's dead, alack the day." Lady Capulet, Lord Capulet, and finally Paris then also sees the body, one after the other, throughout the scene. Lord Capulet says everything that was made ready for the wedding shall now be for her funeral, and her body is taken to the Capulet family tomb. Act 5, Scene 1. Romeo discovers Juliet has died from his servant Balthasar and is devastated, saying, "I defy you, stars." He buys some potion from the apothecary and returns to Verona to visit Juliet's tomb. Act 5, Scene 2. Friar John reveals to Friar Lawrence that due to an outbreak of disease he was stopped from leaving Verona. As a result, Romeo did not get the message letting him know that Juliet isn't dead. Friar Lawrence worries about what may happen as a result and says, "Unhappy fortune, by my brotherhood, the letter was not nice but full of charge, or of dear import and the neglecting it might do much danger." He then quickly hurries to the Capulet tomb. Act 5, Scene 3. Paris visits Juliet's body to mourn her death. He is absorbed by Romeo. They fight and Romeo kills Paris, although he doesn't realize who is it at the time. Romeo then goes to see Juliet's body and takes the potion and dies, saying, "Eyes, look your last. Arms, take your last embrace." Friar Lawrence finds Juliet just as she is waking up, but she refuses to come with him. A noise returns and he leaves Juliet behind. She takes Romeo's dagger and kills herself, saying, "Oh, happy dagger, this is my sheath. There's rust and let me die." The prince arrives and discovers the dead bodies in the tomb, and the Capulets see Juliet with a knife wound. Finally, Lord Montague arrives and tells us that the Lady Montague has died and grief of my son exile hath stopped her breath. The friar returns to tell everyone what has happened. Capulet and Montague agree to end the feud that has taken so many lives, with Lord Capulet saying, "Oh, brother Montague, give me the hand. This is my daughter's jointure for no more, can I demand." Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet utilizes metaphor, symbolism, and personification to further his theme of nature to describe and illustrate his story. The theme of nature is closely tied to the story. Metaphors. Romeo begins by using the sun as a metaphor to his beloved Juliet. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. In the same lines, Romeo has furthered his metaphor by using personification. He creates for us the idea that the moon is a woman who is sick and pale with grief, seemingly jealous of Juliet's beauty. Symbolism. Shakespeare waves floral symbolism throughout the play. Romeo, the object of Juliet's affection, is considered a rose, a specific flower that symbolizes beauty and love, while Juliet's other suitor, the affable Paris, is considered just a flower in faith, pretty but not special in any way. Personification. Romeo, arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou her maid art far fairer than she. This example of personification first compares Juliet to the sun and then personifies the moon. Themes in Romeo and Juliet. The forcefulness of love. Romeo and Juliet are the most famous love story in the English literary tradition. Love is naturally the play's dominant and most important theme. The play focuses on romantic love, especially the intense passion that springs up at first sight between Romeo and Juliet. In Romeo and Juliet, love is violent, ecstatic, overpowering force that supersedes all other values, loyalties, and emotions. In the play, the young lovers are driven to defy their entire social world. Love is overriding theme of the play, but our reader should always remember that Shakespeare is uninterested in portraying a prettied up, dainty version of the emotion, the kind that bad poets write about, and whose bad poetry reads while pining for Rosalind. Love in Romeo and Juliet is brutal, powerful emotion that captures individuals and catapults them against the world, and at times against themselves. The powerful nature of love can be seen in the way it is described, or more accurately, the way descriptions of it so consistently fail to capture it entirely. At times love is described in the terms of religion, as in of 14 lines when Romeo and Juliet first meet. At others it is described as a sort of magic. Like bewitched by a charm of looks, Juliet, perhaps, most perfectly describes her love for Romeo by refusing to describe it. But my true love is grown to such excess, I cannot sum up for some of all my wealth. Love, in other words, resists any single metaphor because it is too powerful to be so easily contained or understood. Romeo and Juliet do not make a specific moral statement about the relationships between love and society, religion and family. Rather, it portrays the chaos and passion of being in love, combining images of love, violence, death, religion, and family in an unpersonistic rush leading to the play's tragic conclusion. Love as a cause of violence. The themes of death and violence permeate Romeo and Juliet, and they are always connected to passion, whether that passion is love or hate. The connection between hate, violence, and death seems obvious, but the connection between love and violence requires further investigation. Love in Romeo and Juliet is a grand passion, and as such, it is blinding. It can overwhelm a person as powerful as completely as hate can't. The passionate love between Romeo and Juliet is linked from the moment of its inception with death. Tybalt notices that Romeo has crushed the feast and determines to kill him, just as Romeo catches sight of Juliet and falls intensely in love with her. This theme continues until its inevitable conclusion, double suicide. This tragic choice is the highest, most potent expression of love that Romeo and Juliet can make. It is only through death that they can preserve their love, and their love is so profound that they are willing to end their lives and is in its defense. In the play, love emerges as a moral thing, leading at such to destruction as to happiness. But in its extreme passion, that love that Romeo and Juliet experience also appears so exquisitely beautiful that few will want or be able to resist its power. The individual versus society. Much of Romeo and Juliet involves the lovers' struggles against public and social institutions that either explicitly or implicitly oppose the existence of their love. Such structures range from the concrete to the abstract. Families and the placement of familial power in the father, law and the desire of public order, religion, and the social importance place of masculine honor. These institutions often come to a conflict with each other. The importance of honor, for example, time and again results in brawls that disturb the public peace. Though they do not always work in concert, each of these societal institutions in some way present obstacles for Romeo and Juliet. The enmity between their families, coupled with the emphasis placed on loyalty and honor to kin, combined to create the profound conflict for Romeo and Juliet, who must rebel against their heritages. It is possible to see Romeo and Juliet as a battle between their responsibilities and actions demanded by social institutions and those demanded by the private desires of the individual. Romeo and Juliet appreciation of night, with its darkness and privacy, and the renunciation of their names, with its attendant loss of obligation, makes sense in the context of individuals who wish to escape the public world. But the lovers cannot stop the night from becoming day, and Romeo cannot cease being a Montague simply because he wants to. The rest of the world will not let him. The lovers' suicides can be understood as the ultimate night, the ultimate privacy. The inevitability of fate. In its first address to the audience, the chorus states that Romeo and Juliet are star-crossed, that fate, a power often vested in the movements of the stars, controls them. This sense of fate permeates the play, and not just for the audience. The characters also are quite aware of it. Romeo and Juliet constantly see omens. When Romeo believes that Juliet is dead, he cries out, "Then I defy you stars," completing the idea that the love between Romeo and Juliet is in opposition to the decrees of destiny. Of course, Romeo's defiance itself plays into the hands of fate, and his determination to spend eternity with Juliet results in their deaths. The mechanism of fate works in all of the events surrounding the lovers. The feud between their families, it is worth noticing that the hatred is never explained, rather the reader must accept it as an undeniable aspect of the world of the play. The horrible series of accidents that ruin Friar Lawrence's seemingly well-intentioned plans at the end of the play, and the tragic timing of Romeo's suicide and Juliet's awakening. These events are not mere coincidence, but rather concepts of fate described about if is the most accepted interpretation. There are more possible readings of fate in the play as a force determined by the powerful social institutions that influence Romeo and Juliet's choices, as well as fate as a force that emerges from Romeo and Juliet's very personalities. Love. Given that Romeo and Juliet represent one of the most world's famous and enduring love stories, it seems obvious that the play should spotlight the theme of love. However, the play tends to focus more on the various that obstruct love than it does on love itself. Obviously, the Capulet and Montague families represent the lovers' largest obstacle, but lovers are also their own obstacles in the sense that they have divergent understandings of love. Romeo, for instance, begins the play speaking of love in warm cliches that make his friends cringe. Although the language he uses with Juliet showcases a more mature and original verse, he retains a fundamentally abstract conception of love. Juliet, by contrast, tends to remain more firmly grounded in the practical matters related to love, such as marriage and sex. This contrast between the lovers appears clearly in the famous balcony scene, whereas Romeo speaks of Juliet poetically using an extended metaphor that likens her to the sun. Juliet laments the social constraints that prevents their marriage. "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny the father and refuse the name." The lovers' haste may raise questions about the legitimacy of their affection for one another. Do they truly love each other, or they have doomed themselves out of mere sexual desire? The theme of accelerated love returns at the play's end when Romeo arrives at Juliet's tomb, believing himself to be too late. In fact, he arrives too early, just before Juliet wakes up. His bad timing results in both their deaths. Sex. The themes of love and sex are closely linked in Romeo and Juliet, though the precise nature of their relationships remains in dispute throughout. For instance, in Act 1, Romeo talks about his frustrated love for Rosalind in poetic terms, as if love were primarily an abstraction. Yet, he also implies that things didn't work out with Rosalind because she preferred to remain a virgin. Violence. Due to the ongoing feud between the Capulets and Montagues, violence permeates the works of Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare demonstrates how restricted violence is to the play's environment in the first scene. Samson and Gregory open the play by making jokes about perpetrating violent acts against members of the Montague family, and when Lord Montague's servant Abraham appears, their first response is to prepare for a fight. Gregory instructs Samson, "Draw that tool," and Samson does so immediately. Violence in the play has particularly significant relationship with sex. This is true in a general sense, in the way the feud casts a shadow of violence over Romeo and Juliet romance. Youth. Romeo and Juliet are both very young. and Shakespeare uses the two lovers to spotlight the theme of youth in several ways. Romeo, for instance, is closely linked to the young men with whom he prows the streets of Verona. These young men are short-tempered and quick to violence, and their rivalries between opposite groups of young men indicate a phenomenon not unlikely modern culture. Shakespeare also depicts Romeo as somewhat immature. Romeo's speech about Rosalie in the play's first scene is full of cliched phrases from love poetry, and Benvolio and Mercutio take turns poking fun at him for this. They also mock Romeo for being so hung up on one woman. Benvolio implies that Romeo's seriousness prevents him from acting his age. Juliet also tactfully acknowledges her own youthfulness. When she looks forward to her wedding night, for example, she compares herself to an impatient child, reminding the audience that in fact that is what she is. Such acknowledgments for the lovers' youth ultimately serve to amplify the tragedy of their premature death. Indeed, one of the saddest aspects of the play is that the lovers die so young, cutting their lives so tragically short. Fate. The theme of ill-fated love frames the story of Romeo and Juliet from the beginning. During the prologue, before the play officially commences, the chorus makes several allusions to fate, including the famous reference to Romeo and Juliet as a pair of star-crossed lovers. Shakespeare coined them the term star-crossed, which means not favored by the stars, or ill-fated. Although the term may seem primarily metaphorical, today the science of astrology occupied a place in privilege in Renaissance society. Thus, the notion that one's fate was written in the stars had a more immediate, literal meaning than it does today. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, then, their fates are cosmically misaligned. This struggle also amplifies the sense of tragedy at the play's conclusion. For instance, when Romeo cries out, "I defy you, stars," the audience knows that his headstrong resistance is no match for fate, and acknowledging her impotence only makes Romeo's agony that much more painful. In the end, then mentioning Romeo and Juliet's fate at the beginning of the play doesn't spoil the ending. Instead, it locks the audience into a sense of tense anticipation of inescapable tragedy. Symbols in Romeo and Juliet: fire, overwhelming passion, either love or hate; stars, fate, doom, love; poison, death, greed, falseness; rose, love and death, and Juliet; and mask, secrecy, putting up a false front. Prose in the play. Prose in Romeo and Juliet usually marks either comic speech or a speech of low-status characters. The nurse, Peter, and the musicians usually speak in prose because they are comic and low-status characters. Mercutio and Romeo mostly use verse, but they often use prose when they are exchanging jokes. Prose can also mark reckless speech, and Mercutio sometimes uses prose when he is being especially provocative. Benvolio begins Act 3, Scene 1, speaking in verse because he is making the serious point that it's dangerous for him and Mercutio to be in a place where the couples are abroad. Mercutio argues back in prose, which shows us that he is being reckless. As his encounter with Tybalt escalates, Mercutio switches between verse and prose. Poetry in the play. Romeo and Juliet contains several sonnets, a traditional form of poetry comprised in 14 rhyming lines, usually about love. Shakespeare himself wrote sonnets, and as did most of the major poets of his day. These English sonneters were inspired by Italian writers, and above all by a poet known as Petrarch, who wrote during the Italian Renaissance. Petrarch established that sonnets should be more romantic love that should be about romantic love that is also a pure and perfected spiritual love. His poems famously compared love to religiousness pilgrimage, as Romeo and Juliet do when they first meet. Petrarch also played with impossible contradictions, like Romeo's loving hate to emphasize the philosophical complexity of love. Petrarch often made extreme and unlikely comparison and linked them to describe each part of his beloved body in isolation. Both these devices work to make love seem impossibly wonderful and pure. Romeo is imitating them when he describes Juliet's eyes as two of the fairest stars in all the heaven. Analyze a sonnet. In the famous sonnet that appears in Act 1, Scene 5, Romeo and Juliet meet, express their interest and desire for one another, and seal their fates. Within these lines, Shakespeare uses an extended metaphor, comparing Romeo to a pilgrim and Juliet to a religious holy site, describing their relationship. Romeo acts reverentially, cleverly, convincing Juliet to let him kiss her, while also treating her as a saint. Structure. In the Act 1, Scene 5 sonnet, Romeo and Juliet meet. It is in these lines that they first encounter one another and share their first kiss. Although it appears within the next of Romeo and Juliet, these 14 lines are structured in the form which has come to be synonymous with the poet's name. It made up of 3 quatrains or sets of 4 lines, and one concluding couplet or set of 2 rhyming lines. This poem follows a consistent rhyme scheme that conforms to the pattern of AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, and GG, and it is written in iambic pentameter. This means that each line contains 5 sets of 2 beats, known as metrical feet. The first is unstressed, and the second stressed. It sounds something like da-dum, da-dum. The majority of Shakespeare's poetic works also contain a turn at the end, between line 12 and line 13. In this case, the last 2 lines are used to emphasize the path that the two are embarking on and allude to the fact that it's going to lead to their eventual deaths. Literary devices. Shakespeare makes use of several literary devices in the Act 1, Scene 5 sonnet. These include, but are not limited to, allusion, metaphor, and alliteration. The first of these, allusion, is quite important. It is an expression that's meant to call something specific to mind without directly stating it. In this case, the relationship that blossomed between the two in this scene sets them from a path for death that was outlined in the introduction of the play. This play is very much about fate and the fact that these lovers were never going to be able to escape it. The alliteration occurs when words are used in succession, or at least appear close together, and beginning with the same sound. For example, ready and rough in lines 3 and 4, as well as have hands and hands in line 7. A metaphor, it is comparison between 2 unlike things that does not use like or as. It also presents in the text. When using this technique, a poet is saying that one thing is another thing, they aren't just similar. There is an extended metaphor that lasts throughout the entirely of this sonnet. It compares Romeo to a sinful pilgrim and Juliet to a holy site that he is visiting. This is the end of my video. Thank you so much for watching.